nothing to do with Laci's disappearance. Even if you think I did, think about Laci. And I know that there's a nation that wants to bring her home.
You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. On Christmas Eve, 2002, in Modesto, California, Scott Peterson's pregnant wife, Laci Peterson, went missing. Scott told law enforcement that he was fishing at the time of Laci's disappearance, and when Laci and Connor's body surfaced on the shore of the San Francisco Bay on April 18, 2003, all suspicion turned to Scott Peterson. Peterson was convicted of the murder of Laci Peterson in 2004 and sentenced to death by lethal injection in 2005. In 2020, his death sentence was overturned and Peterson was sentenced to life without parole. Rabia Chaudry, who rose to fame advocating for the innocence of Haines Lee's killer, Anand Syed, has a new podcast entitled Rabia and Ellyn Solved Crimes. No, that's not what it's called. In fact, it's called Rabia and Ellyn Solve the Case. And in the first episode, they discuss the murder of Laci Peterson, concluding that Scott Peterson is, spoiler alert, innocent. To discuss is Josh Diaz from the YouTube channel The Lab. Welcome, Josh. Josh, what did you think of this podcast?
I think it's a contrarian podcast. I think it appeals to people on the other side that don't like circumstantial evidence, that don't like connecting dots. Everybody wants DNA with a photo of the killer committing the crime or video. There's a big push on that kind of stuff these days where a lot of people do not like circumstantial evidence for whatever reason. And I happen to love circumstantial evidence.
Well, what's interesting is I'm working on a case where they just released a guy who was caught on tape and identified by his father. It really doesn't matter what the evidence is. Whatever the strongest evidence is, they're going to try to attack it. I mean, that's been my experience. But in this case, this is really, like we were talking beforehand, this is really a circumstantial case of a lot of circumstantial evidence.
Right.
I think the way the lead detective described it in an interview was it's like each individual strand of evidence may be not strong on itself, but combined, it's like a very strong web of evidence against him. And I was not familiar with this case, but they set it up like that this was a moral panic or a kind of pitchforky mob that Rabia says she was a part of and that she's deeply ashamed that she was part of the mob. That the police wanted this mob. They wanted to create this mob by feeding the press stories. I'm not even exactly sure what the connection between the press and the police is, but they constantly refer to the police say, and they never refer to the evidence presented in court.
Rarely do contrarians point out the stuff that makes their argument look weak. When you're talking about circumstantial evidence like you just were, I heard a really smart lawyer talk about this once. He said, one circumstance by itself can snap in half. 1,000 of them, you really can't do it. And I'm not saying there's 1,000 of different circumstances, but it's a pretty thick book of circumstantial evidence, just behavioral, and then the mistress involved. And it's overwhelming to me that people defend Scott.
They talk about that they're only going to deal in facts and they're going to present buried evidence. The first was his decision to go fishing. They totally normalize. What are the problems with his fishing trip?
It's Christmas Eve. Who doesn't spend time with their family then? Why did he go an hour and a half away? That, he didn't have to go that far. And then the fact that I believe, 4 months after she's found in the bay where he was fishing that day,
right?
4 months later. And that right there, I don't believe in coincidences. And that would be the biggest coincidence of all time.
Right. He tells some people that he was going golfing. A bunch of people testified that Scott told them that he was golfing at the time Laci disappeared.
Yes.
Told one cop that he was golfing. He told other cop he was fishing. He said he was sturgeon fishing. Sturgeons are enormous, but in a tiny boat. It was 40 degrees out. This is the best part of Ellyn and Rabia's podcast. 40-degree weather, of course you're going to rather be on the water than be golfing because you could have hot cocoa and it would be sort of nicer to be on a cold, drafty water than walking around and warming up playing golf.
I'd much rather be in the bay when it's freezing cold than on a golf course,
Even Ellyn realized her misstep there and said, "Oh, I think we're going to get some letters."
I think maybe she's onto something. Maybe sitting in the middle of a body of water when it's freezing is a good idea to them, and they should definitely try it and see how much they enjoy it because it's ridiculous.
I'm not even done with the problems with the fishing trip. He bought a 2-day fishing pass on December 20th and filled in the dates the 23rd and 24th as to when he would be fishing. So this spur of the moment decision to go fishing.
This is nothing more than him obviously disposing of her body. There's no reason for him to be out there that day. He lies about where he was to many other people. And I'm sure we'll get into the whole dog thing and stuff. Basically, on top of all that, he refuses to take a polygraph. And there's just so many pieces that we can talk about. But yeah, the fishing trip that day, just it's not odd. It's overly suspicious.
Paid for the boat in cash. He wanted a boat with a depth finder. I mean, there's so many things just on the fishing trip alone that would be suspicious, but they also play with the timeline. So they insist that the prosecution was married to the evening of the 23rd, which is untrue. Their theory was always that she was murdered after 8:30 the night of the 23rd to before 9 o'clock the 24th. So they conveniently say, well, look at all the evidence of Laci being on the computer that morning of the 24th. What do we know about the evidence from the computer that morning of the 24th?
From everything that I understand, they're saying that it was Laci, but I believe that Laci was dead by this point. Because he actually drives to his little shop or warehouse or whatever it is, and he's on the computer there. I personally, and I'm curious to know what you think. I personally believe that was him on the computer, not Laci.
Oh, yeah. Well, he was looking at his email, which was password protected, and
right.
The evidence of shopping for a sunflower umbrella stand. Laci had a sunflower tattoo on her ankle and a Gap scarf. Those were ads that popped up from Yahoo. Right. Do you know those targeted ads? So they're sharing a computer, but separate emails. And she never signed into her email. He did. And that's where, of course, there's also a lot of evidence of his affair on there too. But according to Rabia and Ellyn, the affair doesn't matter. They don't deal with it at all. And then they get into Meringue, which is the prosecution's misstep. So Scott tells law enforcement that Laci was up the morning of the 24th and she was watching a Martha Stewart show and it had something about meringue. We know that meringue was mentioned 8 times in the episode on the 23rd and once on the 24th. Peripherally. So which episode do you think is more likely? You would think it would be the 23rd now?
When I was listening to this, it was almost mind-boggling that people, would listen to this kind of garbage, not in a disrespectful way, but basically you're trying to make every flimsy excuse for this man, this convicted killer. Yes, it was. Don't you believe it was the 23rd?
I believe she was killed the evening of the 23rd, maybe early morning hours of the 24th. But he had a long time to clean up. Place smelled like bleach.
Sure did.
There was a mop bucket out. He claimed Laci was mopping or walking. What do we know about Laci's pregnancy and her comfort?
She was very, very pregnant, obviously, and it is really unfortunate. She seemed to be such a lovely person who was really excited about starting her family. But from what I've heard, she had a pretty, not difficult, but it was uncomfortable for sure, her pregnancy, because this was her first pregnancy. And Scott doesn't seem like the cleaning type. I think the only person that would be cleaning probably be Laci, unless you had to clean up some stuff who uses bleach that early in the morning?
Amanda Knox, apparently.
Well, I was going to say, what does this remind you of here?
Right.
It just so happens that there was something happened there, and there's a dead person in the house with Amanda, and she's mopping because she's a very clean person.
Well, there's two problems with the cleaning. Is one, there was a cleaning woman there the day before.
Right.
The second problem is lots of people testified that Laci was having an extremely difficult end of pregnancy. She was at Disneyland the month before. She had to use a wheelchair for some of the time there. A yoga instructor testified that she was having discomfort, that she had asked help her move the baby into a different position. The baby was sideways. She had fainted multiple times before in that park. So just Scott's reaction to having the dog return alone should be the same reaction or similar to Laci's mother, who was so hysterical because Laci had collapsed in that park, gotten dizzy and had to sit down and had incidences beforehand. So he seems unworried by it. And that attitude goes throughout the investigation.
He tells the police, hey, like the last time I saw her was 9:30, okay? At 9:30 in the morning. And that was on December 24th, 2002, when he left to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. Most people do that on Christmas Eve. They just abandon their seriously pregnant wife who's not feeling that well. And
Right.
And apparently, just a really, really good housekeeper mopping the floor and planning to walk the dog. I can't remember. The dog's name was, I believe, Mackenzie.
Yes.
What did he say? He wanted to bake gingerbread cookies and, just he's really full of it. Remember the Martha Stewart thing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where he said he was watching a cooking show that morning, and just everything that he said, especially that morning. He said, I saw her at 9:30 a.m. and then can get into the quote unquote, all the witnesses that saw either a pregnant lady or a overweight lady or a something, or because no other women live in that neighborhood or, within a mile of that place.
So they bring up all these witnesses. What are the problems with the witnesses?
None of them can say that it was her. But now, to be fair, the police did not follow up with a lot of witnesses, probably because they just thought that there was nothing substantial. But there was about 14 or so witnesses that say they didn't say they saw Laci. They said that they saw either a pregnant woman or an overweight woman walking a dog. That area obviously was known for people walking dogs. The problem is there was no substantial sightings. A lot of them weren't followed up on, and which is never a good thing. And you and I both know that happens quite a bit, but it didn't sound like there was much to follow up on either.
Well, let's hear Scott Peterson's lawyer talk about some of those eyewitnesses.
There's been a lot of criticism because we didn't call some witnesses who saw Laci that day.
Scott Peterson's attorney, Pat Harris.
The original thought process at the time was a number of the witnesses who saw her didn't have great memories or were contradicting each other.
Police Detective John Bueller says none of the witnesses were actually sure if they did in fact see Laci.
If you think about that, why wouldn't they call all these witnesses? Why wouldn't they put them on the stand?
Exactly. Mark Garagos, Claire Bronfman's attorney, and I've seen him in court. He is no slouch, the highest price attorney you can get. This was a very high profile trial. I doubt that they're going to slouch on eyewitnesses, no?
You can't put unreliable witnesses on the stand. It's the same thing. Damien's lawyer, everybody says, why didn't they bring his alibi? Damien Eccles from the West Memphis 3. Why didn't they bring his alibis? Why didn't my attorneys bring my alibis? Well, because you didn't have one. They'll just start punching holes left and right in these witnesses' statements. I don't know if you ever saw the Dr. Phil clip where Dr. Phil was talking to the sister of Scott. She's got this, just like a manifesto in a war room trying to prove Scott's innocence. And
yes.
It's almost creepy if it wasn't for the fact that, she loved her scumbag brother. And the terrible thing, she says 14 people said they saw Laci that morning.
I believe that Laci was alive on the morning of December 24th.
There were over 14 witnesses who reported seeing Laci and/or Mackenzie walking in the neighborhood.
14 witnesses that said, I saw Laci Peterson that morning and/or Mackenzie the dog.
They are tips that were called into the tip line. Some of them aren't specific saying they saw Laci, but they're saying they saw a pregnant woman.
Well, that's different than what you said.
Retriever.
You said you had 14 witnesses that saw Laci that morning, and that's not true.
okay, you have 14. The problem is they weren't ever interviewed properly to determine whether or not they had seen Laci.
That is not a matter of record. There are 14 witnesses that said they saw what they thought was maybe a pregnant woman or an overweight woman walking with a large dog.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long way from saying, I saw Laci Peterson with Mackenzie the dog.
And Dr. Phil goes, 14 people said that? And she goes, or they saw somebody. And he goes, well, that's a lot different.
It's a great clip.
It really is.
In some ways, you have to feel sorry for the family because in some ways they're victims too. Not like Laci's family. I can't compare the loss to having someone in prison to having someone murdered, but still, I feel like he's grooming them and conning them too. No?
Yeah, well, he is, but at the same time, where are the other suspects? There was a robbery in that area. Not unusual for Modesto. There's parts of Modesto that are nice, and overall, there's a lot of crime in the valley in California. But they're saying, oh, well, what about those two guys that were arrested for the robbery? I mean, they were like, we didn't have anything to do with this. One of the cops, I believe, stated that it was like a little closer to the day that Laci...
It was drug addicts, and they did it on their street. It was done on the 24th and the 25th, but it was 2 days. Like, they came back and got more stuff.
Right.
Ellen and Robbie are saying it was impossible because there was so much press, but there really wasn't. You can see a video of the time, and there was one van, and I think it was a court TV reporter, Roland, who was down the street.
And you're right. It happened after. Laci was dead before the 24th. Like you said, it was either the night before or early that morning. We're talking, 2, 3, 4, 5. There was a big gap of time there. So he says 9:30 is the last time that he saw her, right? That's telling me, okay, I've got everything, quote unquote, packed up, cleaned up, 9:30. We're good to go in his eyes. Cause I'm going fishing now because I got fishing to do.
But there's a problem because the meringue mention comes at 9:48, and we know that he most likely left the house at 10:08 because of the cell phone tower evidence, something Rabia Chaudry would be familiar with from the Adnan Syed murder of Haines Lee.
Yeah.
We know that pointed to Scott being in the driveway at 10:08, checking his voicemail. So there's not a whole lot of period between 9:48 and 10:08, right?
At all.
They make this huge deal of this robbery, and the whole podcast brings up this issue like everybody was in this frenzy. Nobody was thinking straight. Everybody was just sort of like just running after Scott, full speed ahead, not thinking. I mean, this was such an extensive search for Laci. Helicopters, divers. This was not some fly-by-night operation. The case that was built against over 1,000 pieces of evidence, over, I believe, like 175 witnesses, something like that. Just enormous amount of evidence, enormous amount of effort being put into it. So the idea that these podcasters decades later are going to solve this in a way that the police couldn't at the time is so ridiculous and absurd, but okay. We get into this Medina robbery of the Medina home. They call it the Modesto robbery. But Susan Medina was a witness. She was witness number 21 on June 10th. So what are we talking about here? They're telling their audience that this is new evidence that nobody heard because everybody was too blinded by the media.
DNA, they say, is the gold standard these days, but DNA gets attacked left and right. Look at the Garrett Phillips case. OJ, whatever, on and on and on. So DNA can become, unless it's like direct blood evidence, even then, they're saying Stephen Avery, well, they had a vial of his blood and there was a hole poked in the top.
Right.
They attack every single piece of that. That's the way that people defend very guilty people. See, that's why Scott's death sentence was overturned, was because they were saying that either improper, now they're talking about a new trial, but his death sentence was commuted because of technicalities. More and more, especially in California, talk about Baltimore another time.
Right.
A lot of these cases are getting thrown out or overturned on these crazy technicalities that really don't matter at all.
Right.
The fact of the matter is Scott Peterson murdered his wife and unborn child and threw her in the bay where he went fishing that day. She just so happens to be found 4 months later in the same place that he was, quote unquote, fishing. We can even, at some point, the cinder blocks. We could talk about cinder blocks.
Yeah, please. Let's talk about something they never bring up. If they did, I don't remember it, but I don't remember them bringing up the anchors. Am I wrong?
No, they did not bring up the anchors.
Can you talk about the cinder blocks or the anchors?
Prosecutors believe that he made cement anchors. They only found one. In his little shed or whatever it is, on the counter, there were impressions that he had made 4 cement anchors. You can see the impressions of them. While it's impossible to prove those are the ones, why was he making cement anchors at all? Why was he making cinder blocks? Why was he doing any of that stuff? The answer is, well, because he was weighing the body down. No, they do not bring the stuff up that is overly damning.
I mean, if he was just making one anchor, why was he buying a 90-pound bag of cement?
Yeah, because what was it that they only found the one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he wasn't just making one anchor. And what was he saying? It was for like the garden or something. Nancy Grace had a field day with that.
Well,
one.
That's also someone they blame. They blame the police. They blame the media. And they also blame, especially Nancy Grace, is the cause for this wrongful conviction and the erosion of Scott Peterson's presumption of innocence. The other thing they do is they totally erase Amber Frey. They say she's irrelevant and that Scott Peterson was just a dumb, stupid man who couldn't keep his eggplant in his pants, according to, that's a quote. Would you think that's a fair characterization of Amber Frey?
No. I think that she did what she could to try to help this case after she found out. Obviously, don't believe that she asked for any of this. What she knew about the relationship between Scott and Laci, we only can take her word for that. In a lot of these cases, people always go, well, she knows more. She knows more. Well, obviously, Scott was diabolical. You can listen to the phone calls where he said he was going out of town or he's leaving somewhere, or then that whole debacle of saying that his wife was dead before she wasn't.
Right. He said on December 9th, he said this was going to be the first holiday without Christmas without his wife.
Right. Which shows to me intent. That's why he was charged with capital murder.
He's on the computer looking at the tides weeks before. He's getting the fishing license. He's fishing in 40-degree weather. This podcast also normalizes that Laci was supposedly walking the dog. She can barely walk, walking this dog down this sort of steep incline to this park in 40-degree weather with no coat. And we're not sure what shoes she had on. So it's just a little... It's a little hard to believe. It gets a little hard to believe. And then when they bring up the Modesto robbery and they say this was never explored. Yes, it was explored. The jury heard it and they rejected it.
It definitely was.
We also have the hair on the pliers in his boat. This is a boat that was never used by Laci. Only used this one time on this trip. Never used the lures on the fishing. Didn't really know much about sturgeon fishing, or he was only out there for a very short time. So many problems just with the fishing trip. What do we know about this? I know I keep going back to it, but the hair. What do we know about the hair?
That it did match. I believe it was lineage DNA, right?
I think it was a more general kind of DNA. I didn't fully look it up, but it was like, I think it said MT next to it. Am I wrong?
It was the biggest piece of physical evidence that they had was it did match, mitochondrially?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
To her.
And not Scott.
Yeah, on pliers.
On pliers, right.
Why would that happen?
Then we have Scott asking for cadaver dogs the day after his wife has gone missing. But the dogs themselves, the cadaver dogs that were brought in to track Laci, what did they discover?
The cadaver dogs... There's so much to it. Scott refused to take a lie detector test, right? Which was a good move on his part because he was guilty. The cadaver dogs, when he asked for those, I don't remember if you said that was the day after?
Yes. The dogs traced her scent down to the boat landing.
They did pick up her scent. Why he would ask for that, still baffled. But the problem was, once again, they went after the credibility of the dogs and the handlers. They always do that. They admit, hey, there was a hit down here, but none of it holds up. They go at the credibility of the handler and the dogs and how dogs can not hit on certain down by the water or here or there. That dog clearly hit on her scent. it was completely disputed, which every single piece of evidence in this case is disputed.
So the prosecution brought their own dog experts and presented their evidence, and the defense had their own dog expert and presented their expert, and the jury rejected the defense's explanation and accepted. I haven't spoken to the jury, but I assume, but clearly they didn't decide with the defense, and no appeals court that's looked at this, except on this juror issue, which I agree with you, I thought was ridiculous.
Very rarely in this case at all did they side with the defense.
So we also know that the boat cover was found in his shed in his backyard, covered in gasoline. Scott Peterson was someone who was very fastidious with his things. He kept really good care of his things. Now, the one thing he didn't take good care of was the boat cover that covered this new boat, and he put a leaf blower with the gas thing loose, so it was just covered in gasoline, and it took them 2 days for them to get the scent out of the shed of this gasoline. Let it air out. It took 2 days for the shed to air out.
Yeah, he hid the boat cover. It was drenched, yes, you're right, in gasoline.
He either hid the boat cover or it was a very unlucky mistake.
Like you said, he was very type A about his stuff. He knew that gas was going to get all over it. He did it on purpose, obviously. The reason why is that he was trying to cover up any kind of scent, any kind of whatever was on there. Did a fairly decent job of trying to cover his tracks. Like you said, between the boat cover and between the cinder blocks, fishing in the bay that day, Laci not going on walks.
And he was returning to the scene and just for a couple minutes looking at the divers, seeing where they were multiple times, which is something that killers do. He's very much like Chris Watts. I would say not very smart, clever in some ways.
Smarter than Chris Watts, though. Chris Watts is about as dumb as they get.
I may be the last true crime person who researched this case. I really wasn't very familiar. I remember the press around this case, but I wasn't familiar. I really was expecting a thin case. And what we get at the end of this podcast is just another appeal to authority and a suggestion that you Google the case. They never once suggest that you read the court transcripts, which are extensive and online. Every exhibit from this case, or close to them, are online. Every transcript from the appeals to the actual trial are online. I would suggest that people read that. That's the most unbiased. You can read both sides. You can read the defense side. You can read the prosecution case of evidence that's real evidence that isn't weak, that would stand up under cross-examination. Just thought it was amazing. But you hear Rabia in this say, this is sellable stuff. I thought, oh, well, that's why she's talking about this case. She thinks that it will give her attention to say something so shocking. And I think you're right in that way, that it is contrary to say, oh, well, I'm desperately supporting Scott Peterson's innocence. But she also knows that Scott Peterson's innocence, that they've actually managed to develop a little bit of a group that's out there.
Quite a group, actually. You know, they have Facebook pages, Scott Peterson's appeal.org, all this crazy, stupid. Yeah, he has the right to do this. It's useless. Well, maybe it's not useless because of the Adnan Syed.
That was just fraud. Yeah. Yeah, maybe they'll find another woke DA on the way out in the middle of a fraud case to take up Scott Peterson's case. And Lord knows we're having real issues with our DAs right now.
The lady in Baltimore, supporters are booting her out. I've never heard of a case where a prosecutor takes over, the population drops in number, but the murders go up. That's not supposed to happen.
No. They're a disaster everywhere they go, these DAs, and it's so sinister. I loved going to the Larry Ray trial. That was the greatest trial I've ever been to because the defense was so strong. You want a strong defense. You want a strong prosecution. And that's where we get a really strong legal system.
Sure.
To say that you'd want a DA to really be a defense attorney and work against the victim's best interest and the victim's family and the community's best interest is really sinister and dark. And I can't believe that people are as quiet as they are about this issue, but we'll see as it goes on.
In the Scott Peterson case, yes, it is a highly circumstantial case, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Scott was not concerned. He did not seem to be fazed or anything, according to people extremely close to him, when she went missing. They just said he didn't react.
Look at his posture in his interrogation. And they even mention it in this podcast. They write he's extremely relaxed. And what they want the audience to think, well, he's so relaxed because he's innocent. He's leaning way back. His hands are in his pocket. You should be a little anxious and worried about your wife.
Those are the qualities of a psycho.
I don't think you should be relaxed.
Absolutely not. You think that you would just be desperately begging for answers. When they first pulled him in, he refused a polygraph. The funny thing is, and I said the funny thing, are you familiar with the Dylan Redwine case?
No, I know it, but I'm not familiar with intimately, no.
The dad ends up on Dr. Phil with the mom. She's accusing, because he was eventually found guilty for murdering his son. And they bring in their polygraph expert, and, he kind of dances around. He never takes it, right? Which looks terrible to people. Never mind that they're not admissible in any way, shape, or form, but it gives investigators a direction to go in. You would think that you would be trying to do everything in your power to find your wife or your son. He refused to take it on national television. I remember talking to my friend about it, and I said, can you believe that he didn't take a polygraph? And he goes, yeah, it was a great move on his part. I said, why is that? He goes, because he's guilty, and that was the same thing with Scott Peterson. Was it a smart move for him to not? Yeah, it was a smart move for him not to take it, because it would have been even worse, let alone they didn't even need it. They knew who they were looking at. They knew the whole time who they were looking at. There was one suspect only. There is nobody else that they can point to and go, it's not like Mr. Bojangles with
the West Memphis 3 case. Sure.
All that stuff is a farce. So is Scott's appeals, and so is Scott's defense. I mean, mopping with bleach that morning. There was a cleaning woman there the day before. So I'm going to sit there and huff bleach.
Right, exactly. She's so pregnant, she needs Scott to fill up the bucket, but she's got to get mopping and walking the dog in this incredibly difficult pregnancy. But isn't this just another podcast to normalize the abnormal behavior from Rabia Chaudry? I mean, I was thinking how smart Adnan Syed was to just say he doesn't remember. Mm-hmm. Sure, it's a little suspicious, but look at all the things that Scott Peterson said that came back to bite him in the you-know-what.
You're 100% right. Adnan, he had complete amnesia of the day. Apparently, he didn't even remember that the cops contacted him that day, which they did, the day that ex-girlfriend went missing, Haines Lee. But yeah, Scott stuck his foot in his mouth. But, Roberta, we haven't even talked about, I say, the best part of this case, the most interesting part of this case.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
When he dyes his hair and is headed for Mexico.
With his parents' help.
And fake IDs and burner phones and 10 grand cash. But he was going golfing. And then you see his hair.
Bright blonde.
He looks like the Aurora shooter before then.
Josh, it just happened swimming. It just lightened up swimming to this sort of like neon green, yellow color.
Well, apparently, yeah, that he went swimming in a bowl of peroxide. Did he not just look utterly ridiculous? He was getting ready to take off.
Jurors were given instructions that they could consider the possible fleeing as a sign of guilt in their decision. And defense had to put up with that. They tried to sort of lessen the language around that jury instruction.
I'll never forget that mugshot. He walks into court that day, and you're going, what the hell? He looks like an Oompa Loompa.
Yeah, he knew things were getting bad for him. There's a great interview with Megan Kelly, with the lead detective in this case, and he says no one is that good. As good as you think you can be at planning and carrying out the perfect murder, there are all sorts of things, past tense, that he uses in the Diane Sawyer interview, where he said, we had a great marriage, she was terrific, and then corrects himself and says, is terrific. That was played for the jury. There are all sorts of mistakes you'll make. As great as we all like to think that we would be in getting away with a perfect murder, it's a lot harder than you think. And that's why lawyers suggest that their clients lawyer up and maintain their silence, because the more you say, the less options you give your defense attorney.
They want to get it on the record and lock you into a story. That way there's no wiggle room, no ambiguity, there's nothing. They've got you pinned in a corner. You said this. You see this in trials all the time. Well, let me go back here and get the transcript. Did you say that?
Right.
Well, I don't know. Well, it's right here when you were interviewed. So are you lying? And then you're like, so unfortunately, when Laci was found, that Connor was found outside of of her womb, and they showed to the jury. Everybody in the room seemed to be just completely upset, except Mr. Stoneface. He just had, once again, no reaction to his unborn child.
And also, after she went missing, he sells the car, he tries to sell the house. He orders pornography. You know, it's not just the affair. I mean, we could be here all day. There's just so many little things. All this evidence that comes together that makes very strong evidence. You can knock a few things down. You can say that maybe the dogs weren't handled correctly, or you can say that the plier hair was there before. Try to normalize his behavior, and to try to normalize him saying this is going to be the first Christmas I'll be without my wife is crazy.
The biggest piece of evidence in this case is the fact that he was fishing in the bay the day that his wife went missing, and then she just so happens to float to the shore 4 months later. His entire plan was to get rid of her body and nobody ever find it. He was willing to try to go on with this for the rest of his life. It just so happens that those tides that he was looking up didn't quite work out for him. I read about that as well. You know, he never looked up tides before in his life.
Right. This was not an avid fisherman. They try to say, oh, well, Laci's stepfather went out fishing, so that was normal. But that was a normal thing. He knew what he was fishing for. He used his lure. This was an incredibly short fishing trip, too, to drive this incredible amount. I think he was out there for a really short time. I think it was like 40 minutes to an hour. That's what I'm remembering. I know there's an exact time. Try to write it in the episode description, but very short amount of time. If this is how you're going to spend the day, less than 2 hours fishing on a really cold day like that, of course you can normalize it.
Wasn't even near his house. It was like an hour and a half away. Berkeley is in Modesto. They're not neighboring towns. He went out of his way. You would think if you're going to go out there, you're going to spend a little more time than an hour and a half. You know, the whole reenactment of trying to throw a body into the bay on that boat was just...
It's absurd. You can see him like leaning over, you know what I mean? Trying to make the boat. And the prosecution had their own experts in trial showing how it is absolutely possible to do that without capsizing the boat, which I found interesting that they were allowed to present their evidence and their experts, but Scott Peterson wasn't allowed to. So I would say that there was a great difference in the way that that experiment was carried out and the characters involved for the judge to veto it.
You're 100% correct there. You know, I told you this before. I was in Modesto that Christmas. We were visiting family, and my aunt at the time it's called Old Mill Cafe. It was just a really nice little diner, you know, and Laci and Scott were customers of hers. The Modesto Bee, which is the local newspaper there. I remember Laci's photo popping up on the local news, and they're saying that she was endangered, pregnant, and missing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I didn't think anything of it at the time, obviously, because it was just the news, you know, like you hear stuff like that all the time. I remember my aunt's reaction was rather strong, put her hands over her face, you know, and I remember just kind of going, oh, she goes, oh, I know her. I know her husband. Never really thought much about it. When I get home after the vacation, this story has blown up. And I remember going, yeah, we were just there. By the time we were gone, the media circus was on their way in. Clearly remember hearing when she went missing, and my aunt's reaction to it was pretty heartbreaking. Apparently they were regular customers of hers. So
she didn't suspect him right away.
She didn't say a thing about him.
Interesting.
She was just like, oh God, where is she? The adults were kind of discussing it because they lived not that far from the actual house. I mean, it was just probably a couple miles away. It was just like, wow, you know, when you got home, that was all you really heard about from the news. I mean, it was a
gigantic news story.
Nancy Grace has a lot to do with the coverage that it got, which is fine with me. I could care less.
I enjoyed Nancy Grace back in the day. I know that the people that hated Nancy Grace's program are very loud.
I enjoyed her coverage, and Casey Anthony as well, but it was monstrous. It was a monstrous, absolutely crazy story. It had everything.
Movie star looks, yeah, financial.
Yeah, Scott Peterson was a good-looking guy. Laci was beautiful. Then you got the mistress with the sex, drugs, betrayal, murder. Wrap it all up around Christmas time.
Yep.
You have yourself a blockbuster murder whodunit. People never expect they would look at Laci and Scott and go, oh, they're just such normal people. They were just such a normal family. First of all, that couldn't be further from the truth. And the Rocha family, I feel so bad for them.
Me too.
They're just such sweet people. And like you said, I do feel bad for Scott's family. Who wants to believe that?
Even with Occam's razor, even the fact that the number one cause of death of pregnant women is homicide, more than pregnancy complications. So Occam's razor is never mentioned in this podcast of Robbie and Ellyn's. But there is one quote of Ellyn's that I think I should bring up. She says, our memories are triggered by things we notice. There's no explanation for why that happens. I think the memory experts disagree, Ellyn, but okay. You know, the one thing I did want to talk about really quickly before we go is that everything is mentioned so quickly in this podcast. I've never heard a more fast-paced podcast in my entire life. Occasionally I would miss something and I'd have to go back 15 seconds. Kudos to them for the amount of bogus information they can fit in 15 seconds, but it sure is a lot. Very, very packed with stuff.
That's the best way to push your agenda through. If you have nobody there to rebut you, work off your ideas, you can say whatever you want. In totality, by the end of their episode, if you knew nothing about this case, you'd be like, oh yeah, there's tons of reasonable doubt here, but there's not.
They point to all these wrongful convictions from the Innocence Project, and I've looked at cases for the past 5 years from the Innocence Project, and every one is more ridiculous than the next. A case of a rightful conviction than the next that I've looked at. Doesn't mean there's not one out there that's a good case. I just haven't come across it yet.
I haven't seen one either, and I keep track.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that I think they're harder to find than you would think, than what Robbie is saying, that they're a wrongful conviction every 5 seconds in America.
You know, but isn't Jason Baldwin on the board there or something?
I'm not sure. I know he has his own bogus wrongful conviction organization. Josh Diaz, where can people find you?
You can catch me on The Lab on YouTube and the No Big Deal podcast on Spotify, Apple, and on Instagram. It is JD_the_lab.
Excellent. Josh Diaz, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Are you listening?
I am.
You came to me earlier in December and told me that you had lost your wife. What was that about?
She's alive.
Where? She's alive? Where?
In Modesto. I can't explain any more now.